On Primetime Politics tonight, NATO promises more sanctions and more weapons, but still turns down Ukraine's appeal for a no-fly zone. We'll get reaction to NATO's latest measures from this leading voice in Ukraine's fight for international assistance. Prime Minister announces new sanctions against Russia and agrees to present plans to NATO by June on how Canada intends to spend billions more on defense. This former general and NATO commander weighs in on why Canada needs to answer the bell. And our panel of political commentators on the latest developments in Ukraine and the ongoing fallout from the Liberal NDP deal in Parliament. And we'll begin tonight with the latest developments in the war in Ukraine and how the world is responding. NATO country leaders, including Justin Trudeau, held a one-day emergency summit today and agreed to increase troop battalions along NATO's eastern flank, slap more sanctions on Russia, and provide Ukraine with equipment to respond to the possible use of chemical weapons by Russia. As the war rages on, NATO again rejected demands from Ukraine to impose a no-fly zone to challenge Russian aerial bombardments in Ukraine.
We are determined to do all we can to support Ukraine, and I welcome the concrete offers of assistance made by allies today. At the same time, we have a responsibility to ensure the conflict does not escalate further, because this would be even more dangerous and more devastating.
In an address to the NATO meeting today, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called out NATO leaders for not doing everything possible to support his country and pleaded for just a fraction of NATO's firepower.
Україна зверталась до вас по літаки, щоб ми не втрачали стільки людей. І ви маєте тисячі бойових літаків, але нам поки що не дали жодного. Ми звертались по танки, щоб ми могли деблокувати наші міста, які зараз гинуть. Маріуполь, Бердянськ, Мелітополь і інші. Міста, в яких Росія тримає в заручниках сотні тисяч людей і штучно створює голод. Ні води, ні їжі, нічого немає там. Ви маєте не менше 20 тисяч танків. Україна просила відсоток. 1% від усіх ваших танків. Віддати нам чи продати нам. Але ми не маємо поки що ясної відповіді. Це найстрашніше під час війни – не мати ясних відповідей на запити про допомогу.
So a clearly frustrated president of Ukraine. The Canadian Prime Minister announcing more sanctions today, targeting 160 more Russian politicians. Justin Trudeau has also bowed to NATO demands to present a plan by June to spend billions more on defense to get closer to the NATO threshold of 2% of GDP. But the Prime Minister wasn't being clear on how much more Canada will spend.
Over the past number of years, we've put forward ambitious increases in spending for NATO as part of our strong, secure, engaged commitment of a few years ago. We continue to step up in our capabilities and our commitment to NATO in Central and Eastern Europe and elsewhere around the world, and we will continue to be increasing our defense spending.
I want to bring in Ivanna Klympush-Tsynsadze now. She is a member of the Ukrainian Parliament, the chair of the Committee on Ukraine's integration into the European Union, and a former deputy prime minister. First of all, thanks for taking time to speak with me today. We've reached you in Kyiv today. We've seen the latest response from NATO today to your president's appeals for more help. They've talked about more sanctions, more equipment, more humanitarian aid, but no promise of tanks or jet fighters. What is your reaction to what you've heard from NATO leaders today?
Well, first and foremost, I want to express our gratitude to all the free nations that are helping Ukraine today and are pressing on Russian Federation. I think it's extremely important, and it's extremely important that we see tectonic changes in the policies of different countries towards both Russia and towards the need and urgency to help Ukraine in different areas, starting from humanitarian aid, but ending also with a military capacity being reinforced for us to be able to fight back on this barbaric attack. But obviously, we are saddened by the fact that no-fly zone, as we are being told very openly that it is a no-go from the alliance at this particular moment, that we are not provided with those capabilities that would allow us Ukrainians, our armed forces, to create this no-fly zone by ourselves, thus having access to real long-range air defense, to fighter jets, and also having additional capabilities on the ground to push back on Russian military that is exceeding us in numbers. And they are not they do not care about every human life, and so they are throwing a lot of people and a lot of military ammunition here, just taking it by numbers. That's something that is very it's something that Russia has been using
Right.
in its military tactics for a while.
You touched on it. NATO continues to reject a no-fly zone. They expressed concerns today again about being able to deliver, as President Zelensky appealed for, 1% of tanks, 1% of fighter jets. Clearly, the NATO position here is they don't want to escalate the war to include NATO countries. What is your response to that position?
The thing is that we have to be looking at what Putin is doing and what Putinist Russia as a terrorist state is doing with clear mind and total sobriety. And I think it's underestimated at this particular moment that Putin will escalate with no additional invitation, with no additional provocation. As you know, this war has started with no provocation from Ukraine, so he doesn't need anything to be done additionally by any nation to escalate further. He has been threatening us more increasingly with using of nuclear and chemical weapons, making up casus bellis that he might want to use as a pretext to further escalate. But that does not mean that he needs real actions to be taken place.
What about sanctions? Look, that's a favored tool being used by Western countries, including Canada, which today added 160 more Russian politicians to the list and expanded sanctions against Russian exports. How useful do you believe those have been and are being?
Obviously, we understand that these sanctions that have been unrolled with regard to Russia, they are unprecedented, but they are still not enough to contain Russia and contain this regime from their barbaric actions on the territory of a free and independent nation. And stop erasing us from the map of the world. So unfortunately, when even such decisions are being taken in terms of sanctioning specific politicians, it's good, but it's important also to sanction their families. It's important to sanction their assets and their businesses, and that with regard to everybody who has been sanctioned on those lists, if we're talking about personal lists. Obviously, for us, embargo on oil and gas would be, a goal, but we understand that the EU has to be on board for that decision. SWIFT being only part of the Russian banks being cut off SWIFT, that creates additional loophole for Russian Federation to use it further for their benefit. So a lot should and can be done more.
We're watching NATO's response. You're watching it. I'm watching it. The world's watching it, I'm assuming Vladimir Putin's watching it as well. And I'm wondering how you think NATO's response and its reluctance to go further than it's going. How do you think that's being viewed by Vladimir Putin, and how do you think it might affect his next move?
You see, Putin understands only the language of strength, of power, of unity, and as you see also with regard to Ukraine, he understands only when he is pushed back. So he will try to move further, as he was allowed to move further after his attack on Georgia, then in 2008, then on his first attack in 2014 against Ukraine, and now. So Putin can read this still as a weakness, and we definitely do not want for him to have such an argument and to go totally mad and continue on to other regions beyond Ukraine.
All right. Ivanna Klympush-Tsynsadze, thanks so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Be well and take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Andrew Leslie is a former Liberal MP and a retired Lieutenant General and a former commander of NATO forces in Afghanistan. He is with me now. General Leslie, good to see you again. Thanks for taking time to speak with me.
Thank you for having me on, Peter.
Look, I want to get to the whole issue of Canadian defense spending in just a moment, but let me begin with the moves by NATO today to further support Ukraine. More sanctions, more missiles, more humanitarian funding. Is there anything NATO countries have done today that will deter Russia?
No, not yet. NATO was caught unprepared for the Russian offensive. They had 4.5 months warning while Putin built up his army of 200,000 soldiers, about 120 battle groups. We are where we are. I think NATO's response in the overall construct of the threat of nuclear war or chemical strikes by Putin and the exemplary bravery of the Ukraine people is about as good as it's going to get for now, but more work is required.
Again, we saw a very specific appeal from Ukraine's increasingly, it would appear, frustrated and disappointed President Zelensky for his appeal. Look, just 1% of your NATO tanks and 1% of your fighter jets to use against the Russians. How reasonable or realistic is that request?
From a president, a brave, exemplary leader, from a president such as him, it's natural. And I think the entirety of those who are against Putin, which is most of the world, I hope, would understand that plea as it comes from the heart, because his people are dying. The women and children in his immediate community in his country are being murdered. Having said that, he wants something that NATO can't give, because NATO is not yet ready to fight. And the second that we send tanks or jet fighters into the Ukraine, it's reasonable to think that Putin, who has not had a great string of success in making appropriate decisions recently, because he made some really, really bad ones, we can talk about that later, but it's reasonable to assume that Putin would then declare war on NATO, in which case that opens up the entirety of Europe and to elsewhere into the theater of operations. And NATO is not ready to defend against that yet. That's why they're scurrying now to deploy.
Look, let's get to the spending piece. Canada's facing more and more pressure to increase defense spending and not just increase it, but accelerate it. Canada committed to that today by signing the NATO communique, and today the Prime Minister promised more funding is coming without getting specific. What do you want to see?
Money right now. So there's 3 buckets of money that are required. There's money for people, because the armed forces is 10,000 short of its establishment. So they're 10,000 short of where they should be. So that's about $1 billion plus per year recurring. Then there's at least $1 billion plus per year just to get the spare bits and the weapons up to speed and the training establishments, and that's recurring. Then there's about another $1 billion in infrastructure and hard wiring that's required to get the armed forces facilities up to speed, and that's reoccurring money. And now we talk about equipment, and once again, you can divide that into 3 buckets. There's things which we need right now for the current fight, or to deter the current fight, which is focused on the air, land, and sea assets that we should be sending into the NATO theater of operations. And then you've got the midterm stuff, which is perhaps investments in the Arctic, or surveillance, or security, or enhanced training for the troops. And then you've got the longer lead items, which are the really big ones. Aircraft, such as fighters, such as warships, such as maritime patrol aircraft, such as do we buy more submarines, our supply ships. The list goes on and on and on. Of course, one of the reasons why we're in so much trouble right now is because the list is so long, because people have cashed in a peace dividend.
Yeah, let's pursue this a bit. We've seen governments in the past respond to this recurring pressure to ramp up defense spending, and it's particularly come under focus now with the situation we have in the world. But often what governments have done is, we'll promise more spending, but it's going to come years down the road. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are with the new supply and confidence agreement with the NDP and the spending promises made as part of that deal. It may be tempting to kick spending for defense down the road again. How concerned are you about that?
Well, as a former professional soldier and as a ex-politician and as a former business leader, like many, I'm extraordinarily concerned that over the course of the last, not this only this government, the last several governments, defense spending has gone up and down much akin to a yo-yo. What we have to do is remember that at its root, every prime minister, every president of every country has as their first responsibility a duty of care to protect the lives and safety of their citizens. And right now we have an enormous threat, which has always been there, but now it's active. It's killing people in large numbers, completely innocent people. And for those who are naive to think that it's going to stop soon, those are the same naive people which disregarded the buildup of the 200,000 Russian troops on the Ukraine border and said, he won't attack, it's only a training exercise. So please, let's do that which we said we will do. We've committed for a long time to 2%. Don't kick the can down the road. There should be an immediate multi-billion-dollar injection in year one, with deliveries accelerated because the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance will personally guarantee, by exercising appropriate leadership in cabinet and elsewhere across government, that instead of taking years to produce stuff, we go back to much akin to what we did in the Afghan war, both conservative and liberal governments. We bought C-17s, enormous aircraft in a matter of months. We bought Chinook helicopters on handshakes with our American allies. We bought 100 new tanks from Germany and the Netherlands in much the same process. So it goes on and on. It can happen.
Right, and but in describing what you've described as the need to accelerate, and there are ways of doing that, let's conclude our conversation on this. Even if the government announces new military spending, how relevant is that without, and you've sort of wrapped us around it a bit, without a massive change in our military procurement system? Everybody agrees it's a mess. So announcing more funding is one thing. Getting, putting that, funding into practice and actually getting something for it is quite something different, isn't it?
Well, our procurement system is arguably the worst in the world. I did a little informal survey on Twitter and elsewhere, and we'd be hard-pressed to find a country that's doing a bad as job as we are. And by the way, that's not just this government, it's others in the past. Having said that, when there's an emergency, the government of Canada, both Liberal and Conservative in the past, have shown they can move remarkably quickly. Well, guess what? It's an emergency. It's actually a more dangerous emergency to the global community than that which we saw in Afghanistan. So by the senior leaders in the land exercising personal leadership, finding the right people to blow through the barriers of obstinacy and bureaucracy that exist. By the way, I'm not criticizing the public servants. They're doing that which their political masters have inferred they should do, which is go as quickly as you can, but do it really slowly, which is why it takes 20 years to introduce a new piece of equipment.
All right, we'll have to leave our conversation there, but always great to get your perspective, General Andrew Leslie. Good to talk to you again. Take care.
Thank you.
The good thing is, over the past number of years, as a government, we have continued to step up. We've increased our investments in defense. We've increased our contributions to NATO. And we are right now in the context of the budget and in the context of the upcoming NATO meeting, as we signed on to the NATO declaration today. We'll continue to look at how we will continue to step up.
Well, that was the Prime Minister at the end of the NATO Emergency Summit today in Brussels, promising more defense spending to come. Let's bring in our panel of party commentators now. Greg MacEachern is a Liberal commentator, Kate Harrison is a Conservative commentator, and Kim Wright is an NDP commentator. Good to see you all again. Thanks for being here. Look, Greg, we heard from retired General Andrew Leslie a little earlier on our program that the world faces an emergency right now because of the actions of Russia, and that Canada can no longer put off massive investments in defense spending to reach the NATO threshold of 2% of GDP. I guess the question now is, do you believe the Prime Minister and his government have the will now to go that far and to go there quickly?
I believe they do. I mean, they're certainly dropping enough hints, with both Minister Anand making it very clear. She was almost pitching in public in terms of an increase. And just, from the Ottawa scuttlebutt, we expected, some of us on Monday, to hear the budget date, and we didn't. And we know why. There was a deal between the Liberals and the NDP that was being worked on. But it obviously is going to be a big part of the budget, and perhaps the budget will be pushed off. I'm not sure. We have that window in April where the House isn't sitting, which is usually a really good time to do a road show, to boards of trade, to chambers of commerce.
Right.
But I think so. And I think that there's the will of the Canadian people. I mean, as you said about, the impacts of this, we're starting to feel more economic impact. So after 2 years of a pandemic, we may have food shortages. Russia is now trying to get people that buy, Russian oil and gas to pay for it in rubles to help prop up their falling ruble. So we're going to see some more supply chain, perhaps food and fuel shortages as a result of this too. So I think that helps get people on board.
Kate, successive federal governments have come up short on NATO spending and the threshold. Do you share the sense of urgency for increased defense spending now and the confidence that this government will make that happen?
Increased defense spending, yes. Hitting that 2% target, I think Greg's a little bit more bullish than I am. I've actually noticed in the last week or so the minister starting to peel back some of her language and walking back from that 2% figure. She was before committee yesterday talking about a 70% increase. Well, that is quite different than hitting 2% of GDP. So I think that is a pretty ambitious target at this particular point, especially when the dance partner for the Liberal government, the NDP, is calling 2% arbitrary. It seems unlikely that that's going to be a point of agreement between those two parties. So until we get the actual procurement system fixed in this country, we can throw as much money as we want at defense. That's only part of the issue. We have a real broken system in terms of how we actually get products and how quickly we get them, and you can't really address one without the other if we're talking about delivering equipment to troops.
Kim Wright, do you share the sense of urgency around the need for more spending on defense?
Absolutely, but Kate's actually quite right. It is the procurement process that we have undertaken. I think we've spent more on cancellation fees and new procurement processes than we've actually spent in defense in the last decade or so. So it actually is one of those things that has to get fixed and very quickly. We have shirked that responsibility, hoping and praying that a day would never come that we would have to actually, use our military for more than just peacekeeping. We are now at that day, and Vladimir Putin is not only caring about what's happening in Ukraine, but he still has an eye on our Arctic sovereignty, and we need to make sure that these things get moving and moving quickly. But it can't just be what's the best on the shelf on the global stage. It should be procurement that is also in keeping with our NATO allies and certainly our North American allies, and I think that's going to be a challenge for this government.
Greg, we had been hearing a budget perhaps early April. Now it seems more likely that it might be the end of April. Maybe some people have suggested to me maybe into early May. But look at how does the supply and confidence deal, you touched on it earlier with the NDP and the big ticket social spending agreed to by the minority Liberal government to win a 3-year defeat-free holiday here. How does that complicate considerations to spend more money on the military?
Well, there's, blue Liberals like myself will be looking for a path back to balance. I was sitting with somebody I worked with in the Paul Martin administration, talking to a current member of parliament who described themselves as a blue Liberal, and they'll be looking for that as well. But the old line about events, we are still in a pandemic. As much as we want to be out of it, we are still in it. But in terms of the deal with the NDP, on the dental issue of that, I think that is something that a lot of Canadians can wrap their heads around quite easily. There are issues with dental care and dental health that always, if left untreated, just cost the healthcare system a lot more. To me, that's pretty simple, and people can translate that. And it's going to be one of those things.
But I guess I'm asking in the sense of priorities. The dental care plan wasn't a priority during the last campaign for the Liberal government. Now they say defense is, but they've got these other priorities here that are being dictated by the NDP as part of this agreement. So, there are going to be some tough choices, or do we just say if there's a $340 billion deficit, let's make it 400?
Yeah, and those numbers, should blow our heads off. But, as somebody who moved to Ottawa to work for a prime minister that, balanced our budget, I expected that there'd be a lot more outcry. But, politics of the day is who you have to pivot towards. John Chrétien was facing Preston Manning, who was talking about a balanced budget. The deal between the NDP, I think, is a smart one. It is canny. It, was entirely unexpected. And you don't see the average Canadian being very upset that, two political parties have decided to make a deal and get along.
All right, Kate, what's your view?
Yeah, this is where the deal is going to come up pretty short for the NDP, because I think we will see increased defense spending in the budget, and they've effectively said they're going to pass it regardless. Certainly this upcoming budget, there's basically no more maneuverability for the NDP to have any of their demands incorporated. It's ostensibly baked at this particular juncture. We're coming up on some pretty major decisions around procurement of fighter jets, possibly looking at purchasing an F-35 as one of the final options. That's a very expensive plane. It's had a number of different issues along the way. How is the NDP going to stand beside Justin Trudeau and say, yeah, that's the right decision when they've historically been against that particular plane? That's one of the number of examples where the NDP are going to sell themselves short. They've made this gamble that they're going to get the laundry list of items on the social side down the road. But on things like defense, they're going to be really backed into a corner to try and justify some of the decisions that the Liberal government is about to make.
Let me hear you on that, Kim Wright. Jagmeet Singh was being pressed about this week, and I'm not sure we got a clear answer from him. And the question was this: Do Democrats care if there's more spending on defense, as long as the government follows through with the money for the NDP priorities in the deal that they made with the Liberals?
I think that is right. Look, what we've been talking about is what is right for Canadians and getting dental care and meaningful movement. And there are lots of KPIs within this with this agreement, especially on dental care and other items. But what's interesting is Conservatives are focused on sort of these social programs. I was always curious as how they were going to vote against a budget that was going to have increased defense budgets. That was going to be a big problem for Pierre Poilievre and Candice Bergen going into this budget cycle. The reality is that governing is choosing, and budgets are your window into what you're thinking and feeling that the mood of Canadians are. And where Canadians are at is that we can walk and chew gum. We can have social programs as well as make sure that our defense mechanisms are taken care of. Yeah. Ultimately, Peter, Canadians sent a minority parliament back again saying, get over your egos, figure out how to make this work. This isn't a blank check by New Democrats by any stretch of the imagination. There's a ton of oversight within this document. 30
seconds each here to finish up. Greg, what, if any, risks are there in this deal for the Liberals?
The deals can go awry. This could blow up in their face, and I'm sure the Conservatives are working really hard to find wedge items that will do exactly that. I think that's a big risk.
Kate, what are your thoughts here on what's in it? I mean, Conservatives are calling it a coalition government, but it does buy them time for the next Conservative leader if the deal lasts a whole 3 years. What's your assessment? What risks might be here or advantages for the Conservatives?
Yeah, the risk for the NDP and the benefit to Conservatives is that of contrast. It's going to be really difficult in the next election, Peter, for the NDP to outline how they are all that different from the Liberals when they would have propped them up for 2, 3, maybe 4 years. So I think that that's going to work to the Conservatives' advantage. They can enter the next election saying that they are the only viable, reasonable alternative to Justin Trudeau government. At that point, it could be 10 years deep.
All right. Kim Wright, risks for the NDP?
Look, the risks are always on the communications front, but ultimately we are about how do we get things done for Canadians. Look, this goes back to what Tommy Douglas did on getting Medicare. Jack Layton did this on affordable housing. This is no different than what New Democrats always do in a minority parliament, make it work for Canadians. And that's what you're going to see here.
All right. Thank you all for your time tonight. Appreciate it. We'll talk again. Take care.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
That's all for this edition of Primetime Politics on CPAC, the Cable Public Affairs channel. I'm Peter Van Dusen, and for all of us here at CPAC, thanks for watching.